Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. It's a mouthful sometimes, but I'm always happy to say it. Don, welcome back.
And it's always great to be here. Fun to talk gardening, John, isn't it?
It is, and here we are. We're kind of at the end of August. It's kind of sad to. So you feel like kind of like the season's ending. It's not though, and
exactly.
there's a lot of things that are really kind of coming into great.
Do you
flowers.
ever drive around town and just kind of drive up and down the streets and kind of look and see what's blooming, what's happening, what people have in the yards?
Sam tells me I look creepy because I slow down and I look into people's yards. But it's fun.
Well,
and it's
she's not the only one. My wife Mary does the same thing. In fact, sometimes she suggests that there's a line of cars getting bogged up behind. You might want to speed up a little, Don.
Right.
And so, or I'll pull over, let them pass, then I'll go about my gawking.
Yeah.
But it's fun to see what everybody else has around the neighborhood.
We're observing.
Yes, exactly. We're learning.
Yes.
And of course, it is fun to see what everybody else has. And so it's fun at different times a year to drive around the streets, see what everybody has. And this time of year, the hydrangeas, the panicle type of hydrangea, which we're going to describe in a minute, those are just blooming so beautifully.
Yeah.
And you see them in commercial landscapes, home landscapes. And so that's one of the things that I've enjoyed. And I drive safely, but I do enjoy looking to see. I really enjoy observing what is planted in our areas.
And not to get too ahead of ourselves, but we were saying hydrangeas, but there's a big variety that we're going to be talking about this show. And it seems that even from, my awareness of gardening, that not only a big variety, but things have changed a lot.
Oh,
and you could probably speak to this a little bit later.
We are in gardening good times.
Yeah.
Like I always say, there are so many more varieties of things, annual flowers, vegetable flowers, trees, shrubs, so many more varieties than were available when I grew up. For example, the hydrangeas that we talk about today now, a lot of these varieties that we're observing as you drive up and down the streets that are blooming so beautifully, they were not around. And so we are in some of the best times of my life for gardening are now. And I mean, there's not going to be an end. Plant breeders are so prolific. And so I always look forward to the future and see what else plant breeders come up with. And so...
Well, so let's just jump into hydrangeas. So, like, what is a hydrangea? It is a shrub. It's in the shrub classification, right?
Right. It's considered a shrub, and of course, what makes a shrub a shrub?
Right.
Generally, it's something, of course, that comes back each year, and as long as it's winter hardy for your area, okay. And shrubs have woody stems. Trees, woody stems, woody trunk also, but generally 1, 2, or 3 main trunks. Okay, shrubs are woody, but they have multiple stems all coming from the ground. So hydrangeas would certainly be classified as a shrub because they have woody branches. And so now when we talk about hydrangeas, the hydrangea shrubs, there are 3 types that generally we see offered at garden centers in our area. So we're going to talk about 3 types, okay? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about scientific names, so don't everybody turn your volume down, or don't shut this off.
It won't be too confusing.
No, and we rarely get into botanical names, but the reason that this is important with hydrangeas is there are 2 hydrangea species that are well adapted, and there are some that are not well adapted. For example, okay, have you seen the endless summer type of hydrangeas? In the garden centers or the national chains, they're sold in bright blue, pink, or purple pots.
I think I've seen those. Yeah.
They're also the type that the flower, the blossom itself is like a dark blue, dark purple, dark pink. Okay, and those are in a species that doesn't do so well here. Okay, so my point being that there's a reason why we should look or pay attention to the botanical name, because on the tag of these shrubs, By knowing that and knowing what to look for, you're going to know if this hydrangea is suited for our area or if it's not. Okay, so now rarely in any of our podcasts have we concentrated or had to memorize botanic names. That was for us Hort students, 40 years ago. Okay, so let's talk about the two types of hydrangeas that are well adapted and should continue to be planted. More should be planted. Okay, the first type of hydrangea, and hydrangea is the genus name. It's the kind of the group of plants. Hydrangea, by the way, means water loving, and so they love water. So the hydrangea genus, okay, then within that genus, okay, two well-adapted species. So one of those is the hydrangea that has the great big round white flowers. We sometimes call those the Annabelle type of hydrangea. And, so those are the ones when you're driving around, maybe you've got them in your own yard, the big round clusters of white
And
blossoms.
that's kind of like the classic. When we think of hydrangeas, that's probably what most of us are thinking about.
John. Yep. And so they're the hydrangea genus, and then there's the species called arborescens. And then the Annabelle is the kind of the cultivar trade name. So it's hydrangea, arborescens, Annabelle, or we call them Annabelle hydrangeas. Okay, now on the tag, when you look at the tag in the garden center, it's not going to have hydrangea arborescens up as a main headline. That wouldn't be a very good selling name.
Right, not catchy.
But down in fine print, it will say that hydrangea arborescens and then Annabelle. Now, there are some very new hybrids in that same hardy species, such as the Incrediball. And we'll talk more about that later. So down on the tag in the fine print, it would say hydrangea arborescens Incrediball.
Okay.
So because it belongs to that arborescens species, they're well adapted.
Okay.
So the hydrangea arborescens are well adapted. So any of the new cultivars that come along, peek down at the label, fine print, as long as it has that, those new cultivars are going to be fully adapted, winter hardy. Okay, now the next type of well-adapted hydrangeas are called the panicle type. These are the ones that are blooming beautifully now in mid to late August. They have cone-shaped flower clusters, kind of a pyramidal-shaped flower clusters. Some cultivars are white. Others are white with a tinge of pink. We've got one called Strawberry Sundae.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And again, they're kind of white with tinges of pink as they go along. And so they're called the panicle type of hydrangea. The species is Hydrangea paniculata. And so there's all these different cultivars of that. For example, when you go to the garden centers and you see these beautiful potted hydrangeas, and maybe they're blooming with these nice cone-shaped pyramidal panicles of flowers, and so you see the name on the hydrangea, vanilla strawberry hydrangea. Okay, so if you're trying to determine, is this an adapted type? So you look in the fine print, it'll say hydrangea paniculata, and then vanilla strawberry.
Okay.
So because it's of that paniculata species, it's well adapted. So hopefully I haven't lost everybody listening yet.
So we want to be looking for the arborescens.
Yep, hydrangea arborescens.
Or the paniculata.
Or the hydrangea paniculata.
Yep.
Any of the cultivars of those, for example, if you're seeing one, it says, a nice dwarf little hydrangea that's only going to get 2-3 feet tall, that's called Little Bobo.
Yeah.
And so, well, okay, is that adapted? Okay, well, it's going to say hydrangea paniculata bobo, for example, or little lime.
That one word paniculata, because the other word that we see a lot with hydrangeas is panicle. So talk a little bit about what panicle and paniculata, the connection there, and what that actually means.
Panicle is kind of the a common name for paniculata. And so oftentimes we call that class, the species name paniculata is a little clumsy.
Okay.
So it's kind of shortened to panicle type.
Okay.
And that refers to the shape of the flower cluster is a panicle or a pyramidal cone shaped.
Okay.
Yep. So the panicle type is kind of the shortened common name version of paniculata. Yeah. So oftentimes you'll see that kind of in nursery catalogs or garden catalogs called the panicle type. Okay. So there we have two wonderfully adapted species of hydrangea. And then all the different cultivars that are within each of those species are well adapted. Now we come to a type that is sometimes seen in this area that's less adapted. Okay, for example, if you go to a garden center or a national chain store and you see a hydrangea that's got the name Endless Summer. Or another one you see commonly is Twist and Shout. And it's got these beautiful, deep blue flowers blooming already in the pot. Maybe it's this lavender or a deep pink. There's also, one called Bloomstruck. And so you're wondering, okay, well now, are those well adapted? So we look at the botanical name down in fine print, and those say hydrangea macrophylla. Okay, so right away, that's not one of the two adapted species that we talked about. Now, the macrophylla species is more closely related to the florist hydrangea. When you go into the flower shops or maybe the floral department in the grocery store and you see these big potted, beautiful hydrangeas with the big
for
dark
bouquets
blue,
or for floral arrangements.
The big dark blue blossoms, the dark pink blossoms. The florist type hydrangea, that species, is not as well adapted. So the original Endless Summer, there's a series. The original one was the blue-flowered Endless Summer. By the way, one of my college professors I've referred to a number of times, Neil Holland, who went on to open his own garden center. When these first came out, he nicknamed the Endless Summer Endless Bummer because they didn't always perform so well here. And then that series was expanded to a few other colors. Twist and Shout was one, Bloomstruck, and there's a couple within that species that are all of that macrophylla. Okay, so why don't those do as well here? They're sold here. But they just aren't as thriving, less winter hardy. Again, they're kind of like that potted florist type hydrangea. And so we'll talk more about those later. It's not that we can't grow them here, but they're very difficult. For example, when you drive up and down the streets, for example, on my way to the studio here that we're recording in, I observed some beautiful panicle type hydrangeas blooming beautifully, pink and white. And of course, earlier in the summer, I saw the big, beautiful Annabelle types. When I'm driving up and down the streets, I do not see the Endless Summer series of hydrangeas. I just don't see them because they haven't proven reliable enough for widespread planting. But we'll talk about them later. But you see how when you go to a local garden center, but especially the national chains that might offer things that are less adapted to our area. So if you see some of these hydrangeas and you're wondering, well, is that adapted or isn't it? Look at the fine print on that botanical name. And I promise, podcast listeners, we will not get into many Latin botanical names. Okay, so just to recap, well adapted are the hydrangea arborescens and its cultivars, also adapted hydrangea paniculata and its many cultivars. Less adapted are the hydrangea macrophylla and its Endless Summer series of hydrangeas.
All right, let's take a quick little break. We come back, more talk about hydrangeas.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back, and we're talking hydrangeas this week. And so we just talked about the two varieties, the two that are most well adapted for our area, the arborescens and the paniculata. Those are the things to look for on a label. But let's talk a little bit more about the kind of the names that go with those two.
Oh, and I tell you, these shrubs are just so beautiful. You know, just think a shrub that yields this beautiful and large of flowers is just amazing. So let's first talk about that hydrangea arborescens type, the Annabelle types, they're sometimes called. These are the type that have the great big clusters of white flowers. Sometimes they can get basketball size.
Oh, they're massive.
Yeah, beautiful. And so they are very well adapted to the shade.
Okay.
They're not maybe for the hot south baked dry side of the house, but they do so beautifully on the north side of a building.
Okay.
Or on the east side, morning sun, afternoon shade. So the Annabelle arborescens type shade, they do so beautifully, and they thrive in the shade. They don't just survive, but they just blossom beautifully. And of course, the hydrangeas have such a nice, fresh green leaf. And so that's beautiful. Now, it's important to note how this type grows. Okay. They start each spring basically from close to ground level. So even though they're a shrub, they tend to, during the winter, die back, freeze back, but that's fine because they bloom on what is called new wood. And of course, the new wood is the wood that is the growth that is produced during the current season. So each year, they tend to die back somewhere to around 6 inches, 8 inches. Well, if it's a mild year and you get lots of snow over them, maybe they'll kind of survive higher on up. But they love to be cut back to about 6 or 8 inches above ground level in the spring. We'll talk about pruning later. But so this type of hydrangea loves to be pruned all the way back in spring, and then that encourages a big flush of growth from that lower area. And that new growth like that is what they bloom so beautifully on. So even if you had good snow cover and sometime in early May when you see some buds coming, even if there are buds farther up, higher than 6 to 8 inches, you could leave them, you could let it grow. But by pruning them back hard, quite a ways back, they'll just tend to bloom a little better. So anyway, it's important to understand that type that loves the shade, but that also each year they will be cut back or kind of freeze back to the lower part. And so, what other beautiful things can we say in that group? Oh, there have been new cultivars. The long-standing older one were the white type. Mm-hmm. And they had smaller blossoms. So then when the cultivar that was actually called Annabelle came along, that was a bigger flower than some of the older types. But then they developed a variety cultivar called Incredible that had a stronger stems.
Okay.
Sometimes the blossoms on the Annabelle type are just so huge they can kind of weight down a little bit. The Incredible was developed to have a little stronger stems that better able to hold up the blossoms. There's one called Invincible Spirit is another cultivar of that. And there are even some that have a pink shade. White is still kind of the classic, but there's kind of a rose pink, light pink shade also of this well-adapted species also. Sometimes in gardening magazines, you'll see this species called the smooth hydrangeas. I don't see that name too often. But I do see it occasionally, this species referred to as the smooth hydrangeas. I'm not sure exactly where it got that nickname, but sometimes you'll see that in gardening books or gardening magazines.
Okay. What about? Go Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, and I was going to say the next type of well-adapted are those that we call the hydrangea paniculata, the panicle type, with the pyramidal cone-shaped blossoms. And those perform more like what I would call a normal shrub. Okay, the Annabelle type tends to freeze back, die back, which is fine, grow from the base. The panicle type of hydrangea acts more like a normal shrub. It doesn't die all the way back like that and come from the base. It leaves out each spring from the normal branches above. And so you don't do that hard pruning back every year, that severe pruning. You just shape it a little bit. We'll talk more in detail about pruning a little later. So anyway, if you kind of follow me, it leaves out like a normal, like all the other shrubs do. And of course, then they, I should mention their preferred sun exposure.
Okay.
They like more sun, and when I say they like more sun, they'll bloom better if they get more sun than the shade-loving Annabelle types.
Okay.
So the panicle type of hydrangeas like more sun. They can be planted in full all-day sun, or maybe on the east side where you get morning sun, afternoon shade. So they will blossom much better with increased sunshine than the Annabelle types. Oh, and there's so many new cultivars. I mentioned that these were gardening good times. There was just a species of this when I was growing up. There was a species of it with kind of smaller panicle type of blossoms. But then the hybridizers got busy. And one of the classic of this is one called vanilla strawberry.
Okay.
That just has beautiful, a big pyramidal flower cluster has a blend of colors, white and pink and rose pink, and it's just beautiful. And some of them have kind of lime-colored greenish flowers. Some are white. Some are total pink. And so in the garden center, you'll see many different cultivars of this. So they'll vary some in flower color, but also in height. There's a little something for everybody in that type of hydrangea. Some are only 2 feet high. So for a small landscape, you'll have just these nice little kind of miniature bushes, but they bloom just so prolifically.
Yeah, I suppose like if you wanted to set up like a row or an edge or along something like that, that would be a really kind of a nice option as opposed to the big Annabelles, which get so big and can flop, like you said.
Exactly. And you hit it, John. If you want to have kind of a row of these or a multi-row or multi-planting of these, for example, the panicle type, you can have one of the little ones in the front that only grow a couple of feet tall. And then, as we've done in one of our landscape beds, then we've got behind that one that grows taller. In our case, it's a strawberry sundae that'll get probably 4 feet tall. And some of the varieties will get up to 8 or 10 feet tall. So you see some of these around town that are quite big and massive and just loaded with big
the panicle
blossoms. Right.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So when you're looking at the garden center, in addition to looking at the flowers, check the tag for what height it will get to, because there's a big, wide range of cultivars in varying height. And that's what makes them so useful in the home landscape. For almost any location, there's going to be one of these that will fit into that. And some of the names that you'll encounter, I mentioned vanilla strawberry. There's quickfire, little lime, little lamb, pink diamond, my strawberry sundae, and many, many more. Again, all fitting into that winter hardy, well-adapted panicle type of hydrangea.
Do those names, like the Quickfire, Limelight, I'm familiar with those. You talked about Bobo earlier. Do those tell us anything, or are those rather okay? Okay, I was just wondering, like, is a Bobo a certain type of a panicle?
Yeah, no. Wouldn't it be fun to be kind of in the division in a plant breeding company when they're brainstorming on what to name this new cultivar? Wouldn't that be kind of fun to see what goes through until they decide on the name Quickfire or, vanilla strawberry or strawberry sundae? I love that name. So anyway, those are cultivar names. And in most cases, the marketing department is trying to come up with something. I'm not sure what bobo means.
Yeah.
But little lamb is kind of descriptive of the little tiny
too,
limelight,
the lime color,
the lime color of that. And so anyway, they don't they don't indicate much more than the market people trying to give us kind of a clue as to what that might be, or a kind of a neat name that's catchy.
When you were talking about height, it made me think of one thing. We haven't really talked about this yet.
That?
Hydrangea standards. Or the hydrangea it's almost like a tree, right? So talk a little bit about that because that to me is also something that's kind of new.
Yes. And my wife, Mary, wants one of these, so I'm going to get one. Well, actually, we had one a couple of years ago until the snow got so high and the rabbits ate everything up on top. But, in the meantime, I fence some of these things. So, let's talk about that. The panicle type of hydrangeas with the pyramidal cone-shaped flowers, they can be created by the garden centers into little miniature trees. So you have a single trunk, and then up on top, at a certain height, I don't know, usually the top part is, maybe 5 feet above ground or something.
Yeah.
So you've got single trunk, and then up on top, you've got, as a little miniature tree, you've got the panicle hydrangea shrub. So it's kind of a shrub up on top of a trunk.
Yeah, it's like an ornamental tree. It's not gonna branch out and get
right.
Up to 30 feet.
It's not a boulevard shade type tree. But as you've described, John, they're a little kind of a miniature tree, and those can work into a home landscape beautifully. So in this panicle, and I'm glad you brought this up, in that panicle type, you've got the type in the garden centers that are a standard shrub, planted on the ground, but you've also got some formed into trees, and those make wonderful little kind of unique specimen type trees.
Yeah.
And they bloom just as good, whether it's the kind of the shrub type or the type formed into a little miniature tree. Both bloom well, both well adapted.
When we talk about kind of planning the winter, we'll talk during a podcast, we'll talk about planning a garden. And one of the things that we talk about that really to consider is having different varying degrees of height to something that draws your eye. And boy, I think when I see these out in a yard, they certainly do that. You tend to see them maybe off the corner of a house, set back a little bit because they get taller, so that you can have things in front of it. But it is a fun thing.
And the landscapers talk about the importance of layering in a landscape. Having your landscape out, for example, from the house, having it out far enough from the house so that you can create layers. Layers being things of different height. Things that grow shorter, taller. You have these different layers rather than everything just on one single plane. And of course, the hydrangea trees that you brought up are a great way to give a taller layer effect in the home landscape.
All right. So, Don, I've got a lot of questions, but first of all, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, I'm going to ask some questions I think that I have, and I think some that probably a lot of the listeners may have too.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back and we're talking about hydrangeas this week. Before we took a break, we were talking about the standard hydrangea, and you said that you had one, but eventually the rabbits got to it. Are hydrangeas, are they particular food for rabbit and deer and other pests? Is that something to consider if we're wanting to be planting? Because it's an investment of a plant.
It is.
They're not.
They're not cheap.
They're not cheap.
Well worth what you pay. But,
right. It's not like planting daylilies, too.
Yeah, they're not a bargain plant, but worth every cent you spend. So they are free of insects and diseases.
Okay.
Okay. So there's really no insects that bother them. No, they don't get diseases. But in the middle of winter, when rabbits and deer have little else to eat, they'll start going for our shrubs, and they will go for hydrangeas.
Okay.
Just like the hydrangea tree that we had. Snow got high enough that the rabbits nibbled the entire top off. All I was left with the skinny little trunk.
Yeah.
And so I ended up having to replace it. So I should have fenced high enough. And so deer and rabbit will affect hydrangeas.
Okay.
But it's not like they will search for miles around, to come to your yard just to eat your hydrangea. But if you, if you're in an area that's prone to traffic by rabbits and deer in the wintertime, you might want to protect the hydrangea.
If you wrap it around the tree, if you protect the stem in this case, or the stem, or it's not really a trunk, but it's trunk,
sure.
Yeah. Will it damage the plant will it damage the shrub if they eat just the leaves or the spent flowers, or is it just a matter of protecting the trunk is really the foremost thing?
Yep, you got it. Because if they do a little nibbling around the outer twigs, no problem at all. And the nice thing about the Annabelle type, which we say go back close to ground level anyway, well, if the rabbits eat most of the top off, they've done the pruning for you. But it's the panicle type that, like I say, they operate like a normal shrub where they leaf out from all the above ground branches. If the rabbits or deer browse off most of those, then of course they're just shortening the height so badly. They might not kill it. Unless it's the tree form where they really ate off most everything for me. So anyway, I would definitely consider giving some winter protection. Maybe one of the repellents, liquid fence, plant skid, Repellex, or fencing on a hydrangea. But again, many of the things in our landscape we need to protect. So it's not like they're going to require special. I guess what I'm trying to say is deer aren't going to come from miles around just to search out yours.
They're not necessarily attracted to it rather than they'll go to it out of necessity.
Yeah, exactly. You got it, John.
Okay, well, let's talk about one of the big things with hydrangeas, and that's the maintenance is it's not overwhelming, but one of the big things to consider is whether you need to prune or not. We talked a little bit about this, that the Annabelle, that variety, you would need to prune, right? Because that grows on new wood.
Right. That grows on the new wood, like you say, that's produced during the current season. Okay. So the Annabelle type of hydrangea or related species of that are quite easy. Each spring, all you do is cut them back to about 6 inches. So I just take a pruning shears, my handheld pruning shears, because the branches don't get that thick. So handheld pruning shears and just clip it all back to about 6 inches above ground level. You could prune a little higher than that if you want, but since the blossoms come in such a tremendous force on the brand new shoots, I like to cut it back hard like that. When you say you prune it hard, you prune severely.
Yeah.
And then that sends out such a burst of good growth and they just bloom so well on that. Now, when I say prune in the spring, a common question is, can we prune those in the fall of the year? Well, you could. It probably wouldn't kill the hydrangea, but most things really shouldn't be pruned in the fall of the year. There's not a benefit to fall pruning. And the reason for avoiding fall pruning is we're making cuts that remain open right before winter, and there's more chance of desiccation, drying out of those cuts, more chance of winter injury. It doesn't mean if you prune a shrub like hydrangea in the fall, it doesn't mean it's automatically going to die, but there's just more chance of something going wrong, and there's no advantage to fall pruning. So the best choice is to wait until spring while the Annabelle hydrangea is still dormant, and then, so we're probably talking April, and then give it its good hard cut back. So they're quite easy to prune. And
while you say we don't want to be pruning in fall, deadheading's okay though, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Oh, so now, okay, that brings up the question. And of course, we're still talking about the pruning on the Annabelle, the big rounded flower types. So that brings up the good question. Do you leave those flowers on, those big flowers on, or should you remove those? Now, the Annabelle hydrangea is fascinating with the big round white flowers. After the flowers start to fade, they'll usually go to a greenish, and then to green, they progress to tan, and then they dry. And they're kind of pretty in the winter landscape, almost like a dried flower arrangement on that shrub. And so there's nothing wrong with leaving those on and then just removing the flowers when you're doing your big spring pruning on those. So you can certainly leave them on. If you're afraid that they might catch snow, and we'll talk about this in the panicle type a little more. If you're afraid they might catch snow and just get too floppy, you could remove the flowers after they've dried, and that would be fine too. Or if you don't like the look of them, the flowers going to green, after they go white, they fade to kind of a green. If you don't like that look, you could remove them. But next, let's talk about the pruning on the panicle type, the paniculata types. So as I mentioned, those hydrangeas grow more like a normal shrub. Instead of dying back, they come from the above ground branches. And so the pruning on those can be each year merely just to shape it a little bit, if you need to control the size. Now, the flower clusters can also be left on over winter. They're kind of pretty. After the flower colors fade and late in the fall, after frost, the flowers dry. But usually they'll persist on the shrub or the little tree. They'll persist all winter, but it looks kind of like a dried flower arrangement, gives interest. And so those flowers can be left on all winter and then clipped off, just kind of where the flower meets the stem, just clip them off. Sometimes just by hand, they'll even just kind of snap off in the spring because they're crisp and dry. Occasionally, people might be concerned that the flowers left on over winter might catch the weight of snow, especially if we get a heavy wet snow, and that could break the branches. Because as I mentioned on this type of hydrangea, we need to preserve those branches. They don't get cut all the way back. So if you got too much branch breakage, that could affect the structure of those. So one rationale, if you're a little afraid that those big dried blossoms might catch the weight of snow, you could remove those before the snow season hits in. So now the pruning of those panicle type should really wait until spring. The pruning of the branches, if you need to limit the height or something, should really wait until spring. Now that type of hydrangea also blooms on what is called the new wood. It blooms on the growth that is produced during that season. Some of the other species of hydrangeas that aren't well adapted here bloom on what's called old wood, meaning if you prune at the wrong time, you're cutting off all the flower buds. They bloom from wood that has lasted a few years. But what's nice about our adapted hydrangeas, they bloom on just the current new wood that's produced. So no matter how you prune it, you're not pruning off old flower buds or something, if you follow me.
Yeah.
It's going to bloom almost no matter how you prune it.
How about if you, let's say you bought a house, right? And you inherit this garden, but you don't know anything about it. Is there a way to tell if your hydrangea is, before it starts growing, if you move in like late fall and there aren't the flower heads on there, is there a way to tell if it's one that'll grow on old wood or new wood? Is there a way by looking at the stems?
Yeah, if it has survived in our area, the upper Midwest, chances are it is one of these two types. So the other type,
I was just wondering if you should know, like if you move in like
sight,
November,
you probably would not know.
Okay. I was wondering because if I'm thinking like our dogwoods, when we cut our dogwoods back, sometimes you'll get shoots that will grow off to the side of the cut. And I wonder if you see that on if a hydrangea if you see that on a hydrangea, then you know that that's one that you should be cutting back a little bit.
Sure. The arborescence type, if you kind of look at the structure of those, almost all of the branches are coming from one central point out of the ground level.
Okay.
They kind of all generate, if you follow me, kind of from one central growing point. All the branches are coming up and out, most of them anyway. The panicle type of hydrangea, or more branchy, not everything all originates from that point down at ground level, but they've got kind of branches more similar, maybe to the dogwood or something like that. But there are other type of hydrangeas grown in other parts of the country that are kind of similar to that too. And so unless you kind of knew that an oak leaf hydrangea probably wouldn't have survived here.
Yeah.
But otherwise, there probably isn't a good way to know. But that is interesting.
Oak leaves are beautiful. They are a beautiful hydrangea. It's too bad that they're not up here. But we've got other varieties to choose from. Like let's say somebody bought an Annabelle because they wanted those big white flowers, those big, really showy flowers. But then they realize that after a couple of years, after the Annabelle grows and gets to a good size, it tends to flop. Is there a way to help your hydrangea from flopping? And is a
problem.
One thing I was looking this up. One thing is because of the name, hydrangea, water loving, that if you don't water it enough, it may tend to flop.
Exactly.
What things should we be doing to keep old Annabelle hydrangeas from flopping?
Yep. If they're water stressed, that can cause more of I guess kind of almost a wilted type growth. They just won't be quite as turgid as if you keep them well watered. All of these hydrangeas love mulch. Okay. They'd prefer not to be growing in rock if at all possible. They'd rather have a wood type mulch. Okay, so just generally hydrangeas love that. But specifically to the Annabelle type that flop, sometimes a peony type cage, a tomato type cage, when the branches are first growing, you put the cage on so the branches will kind of grow up and be supported by the cage as they grow. That can be done if you've got, especially one of the older varieties that might be a little floppy but still beautiful. And so that can be done. When the branches get to a certain height, you can just wrap a twine around, that gets kind of concealed under the leaves, but you can wrap a twine around the stems and kind of cinch them together like that so they're less floppy and the twine gets concealed. And so those would be kind of the two main ways. One thing that sometimes I will do, okay, I mentioned cutting them back to 6 to 8 inches. Occasionally, I will leave a dozen or so longer branches, even though they're dead. I'll leave a few, and so sometimes as the new growth is coming up and out, sometimes those older branches will tend to support it a little. But the preferred would be to give some sort of mechanical support. But now that's why the Incredible and some of the newer varieties were developed for more branch strength. But you'd kind of hate if you've got a beautiful hydrangea. You'd kind of hate to have to dig it out even to replace a new one. Sometimes I don't have quite that courage.
Yeah. So, we're getting people pumped up. We're talking about the great things about hydrangeas, and you're going around, you see a hydrangea that you like, you find we still have time to plant those right now, right?
Yes, fall's a great time to plant the hydrangeas.
What should we be looking for when we're planting? We talked a little bit about the Annabelles. They can be in a little bit more shade. The paniculata, panicles, they want a little bit more sun. What other things should we be considering?
Let's talk about the soil.
In planting. Yeah, soil is a big factor.
A big factor in hydrangeas. Hydrangeas love organic soil. And of course, in our area, it seems you either inherit a heavy clay soil, or maybe east of here, maybe you've got light sandy soil, and neither of those are really preferred by hydrangea. And so hydrangea really love an organic type soil. So at planting time, to really amend the soil with either your own compost or peat moss, they love peat moss, any of the even bagged manure, to really work that into the soil in which you're going to plant the tree, and amend the soil that you're going to backfill. I said tree, the shrub or little tree. And so really amend that soil and maybe even put a layer of peat moss or compost on the soil surface even before you put your wood mulch around. So they really love an organic type soil. That's a very important step. And that brings up the interesting point that we've all seen, the rumor that you can affect the color of hydrangeas by whether you put acid in the soil or alkaline in the soil. And if you adjust the soil with this fertilizer or that fertilizer, you're going to affect the color. Well, in parts of the country with other species of hydrangeas that don't grow here, you can adjust the pH. If it's an alkaline soil, and if they add acid to it, it'll change the color, and vice versa. If it's an alkaline soil, add acid. But our soils generally in the upper Midwest here the acidity or alkalinity, pH of the soil cannot be changed enough to affect the color of a hydrangea, because trying to change the soil of the pH of our alkaline soil, it's like trying to change the color of the ocean by adding some food color. We just have such a huge mass of alkaline soil that we're not going to change it enough to affect the color of our hydrangeas. Plus, the species of hydrangea that will change color is that type, the macrophylla type, that is not as well adapted here. So in other words, I can't take my strawberry sundae hydrangea that is pinkish in color, I can't acidify the soil enough to get it to turn blue. Right. That's just not, it's interesting in the gardening magazines or on Twitter or Instagram, but in our area, you just can't. That just does not really work. I should mention that type of hydrangea, the endless summer type with those intense blue or intense pink colors, a few people in our area have had good success. So if you have bought one, a few years ago, I actually did kind of a survey. Has this worked for anybody, that type of hydrangea? 99% of people said no. A small percentage said yes, they've gotten those to grow, and they did the same thing. They planted them in a microclimate, in a well-protected area of the yard. They amended the soil very heavily with peat moss or organics. They used wood mulch. They put drip irrigation to keep them very, very moist. And in the wintertime, they pulled the chip mulch up over the plant to give it some protection. But without those cares, most people did not have good success year after year with that type of endless summer macrophylla type of hydrangea.
So we've got an old Annabelle that was big when we moved in, and now 7 years later, it just keeps growing. It's going great. But I look at it sometimes and I think, can you split a hydrangea?
You can.
Oh, okay.
When we moved to our new location 8 years ago this month, there were certain shrubs that I wanted to take along. Some things were big, old, woody. There's no way you're going to move some of those old things. But our Annabelle type hydrangeas, that kind of come from the branches all come from one point at the ground. They tend to send up these little offshoots. Mm-hmm. And so from one Annabelle hydrangea, I created 4.
Okay.
And so they have these little offsets around. So I didn't even have to dig up the big older part, but I just took 4 of these little offsets around. So essentially I split it into more. The panicle type of hydrangea usually does not form those little offsets. Not saying it can't be done, but I've never quite seen that you were able to split one of those the way that you did the Annabelle type.
And then what about transplanting? If you can split it, then I'm taking it, you can transplant it too.
Sure, you could easily transplant. And if you were looking to move or transplant or split a hydrangea, the best time would be early spring.
Okay.
Just as they're thinking about starting waking up for spring, as opposed to doing it during the active growing season, which would cause more stress on the plants.
So with an Annabelle, you'd want to prune it first and then
you got it. Okay. Yeah, prune it first. And then that would make the moving and the digging and dividing and splitting much easier.
Much easier,
on it,
because you're not having to deal with all those.
Yeah, but that yielded us 4 really nice ones.
Oh, that's really kind of a great thing. If you have something that you like, and then you can kind of split it up and gives you that kind of something to use in other parts of your yard. And
it does. And like I've said before, it's not that we're trying to garden on the cheap, but if I save a little money on those hydrangeas, splitting them, then I have a little money to go to the garden center and buy a new plum tree.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about hydrangeas too, is that they really are they're relatively easy. They're not difficult. They're not overly fussy.
I'd say, yeah, exactly. If you give them what they want, hydrangea means water loving, so put them in the right proper location, mulch with wood chip mulch, water them as they need to keep fairly moist. They give so much back for minimal care.
And they really become a substantial part of your garden. That's why I was wondering too, if it's growing so big, if you could kind of move it around. That's a fun idea.
So I guess one suggestion, as long as you mention that too, is be sure when you are shopping for hydrangeas, be sure you look careful at the height and the width.
Yeah.
For example, if you need one that only grows maybe 3 or 4 feet high and wide, and they tend to grow kind of rounded, the shrub type ones. And so make sure that you don't get one that grows 6 to 8 feet. Otherwise, if you've got limited space, the big ones might be too big.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun to talk about hydrangeas.
This is one of my favorite shrubs to talk about because they just give us so much.
Well, so if people have questions about hydrangeas, or if they have pictures of theirs, if they have got a really good standard, or if they've got a particularly interesting color, what's the best way to send those pictures to you or to reach you?
Yeah, I would love to see some photos. Email donald.kinsler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu. And the other thing that's fun, and kind of parting remark here, that another thing that's so wonderful about these hydrangeas, especially the panicle type, the colors change. They start out maybe white, and then some of the varieties then start developing pink shades. And so there's interest as time goes on. And also the weather, the temperatures can affect the color tones. And so they're a fascinating, for anybody that enjoys kind of really watching plants, these are some to watch because they'll give us something to see.
All right. Don, thanks a lot for talking to hydrangeas.
Thank you, John, and everyone have a good week.